Well, this is the one there.
Yeah, let's talk about this one.
Yeah. Well, that's my good friend,
Right, Ralph.
Ralph Hansen.
Yeah.
And this is Vic Scholas. And
The talent here is Cab Calloway, right?
yeah.
And then this is the HAS morning guy, right?
Yeah.
Jim Walton, is that what his name was? Jim Walton?
Vic Scholas and Jim Walton,
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so what did Scholas do? Was he the manager of?
Scholas was the manager, and then when the thing occurred, Scholas wasn't there. And Ralph Hansen was the man I approached about WHAS doing a telethon. And he told me, he said, we need to get in touch with Scholas because Scholas runs the station. So Scholas was working on a political campaign, and was up in north central country near Chicago somewhere. And we called him on the phone, and he wasn't available and all that. And finally, I told Ralph, I said, we've got to make a decision, And he said, well, let's call him again. Come on to my office. So we went to his office, and he put in a call for Scholas, and lo and behold, Scholas answered.
Oh, great.
And Ralph explained to him that we wanted to put on this telethon, and it would be the first one in Kentucky, and it would run for about 14 or 15 straight hours and raise money to help cerebral palsied Kentuckians. And Ralph explained all this and did it very clearly, I thought. And I presume that Scholas listened to it. I don't know. But anyway, Ralph was talking on the phone, and so I was sitting right across from him. And as he finished, he said, well, what do you feel like, Scholas? And he held the phone out so I could hear it too, And Scholas said, damn it, Ralph, you're the boss, you make the decision. And he slammed up the phone. And so Ralph looked at me and he said, high five. And we high-fived. And he said, we're on the go. We're going to do the telethon. I said, okay. So from that moment on, we worked together, and we got the first one going. And it was quite a marker. The lead entertainer we had for the first telethon was probably the most popular entertainer Kentucky had at that time. At least in my opinion, my judgment, it was. And of course, that most popular entertainer was Rosemary Clooney.
Oh, she was the superstar of her day.
Yeah, she was. And Rosemary insisted that everybody call her Rosie. And she accepted the job. She said she'd come to Louisville, and so we met her at the train down at the Union Station in Louisville, and we had a police escort of several police cars and all, and we had a big limousine and everything. And we got Mary in the limo and got Rosie in the limo, and we headed off downtown, And
so where did she stay? Did she stay at the Brown or at the Sailbox?
Yeah, we had a suite for her at the Brown Hotel.
Yeah.
And she stayed there, and that's where her co-star Gary Moore stayed too.
Yeah.
And so the first telethon, the best way I know to put it. The idea came from Joe Donaldson. Joe was a leading member, I think the elected leader of the parents group for cerebral palsy persons. And they were a considerable group in Louisville. I think there were about 60 or 70 members, and they had a large group of cerebral palsied people that needed help, you know. And they weren't just children, they were some adults too. And so Joe called me one day and said he wanted to take me to lunch. And I said, okay. And we went to the Brown Hotel for lunch at the English Grill, which was a venue I could very seldom afford. And anyway, we had a nice lunch. And to summarize it, Joe told me that they had been looking for a director for United Cerebral Palsy of Kentucky. And of all the people that they had reviewed, they thought I was the best qualified. I had an undergraduate degree in journalism, and I had worked for the Louisville Times for several years, and I had a big background in press relations and all that. And I also had had experience with voluntary health agencies. I'd worked for the American Heart Association, and I'd worked for the American TB Association. And I had also been an executive assistant to the State Commissioner of Health in Kentucky. And he said, you are by far the best and most qualified person we could locate for this job, and we would like to offer it to you. And I said, well, I need to think about it. You know, I said, this is just like a cloud unfolding and the rain and the snow coming out and everything, you know. I said, I'm just not prepared to answer right now. And I need a day or two to question some people and find out some things and so on. So Joe said, okay, but he said, the sooner you can respond, the better. And I said, all right. And so I spent the next day and a half asking questions and talking to people, and nobody knew much, you know. United Cerebral Palsy was a brand new voluntary health agency, and it had no experience, no active activity on the field. And anyway, to cut to the meat of this thing, I found out what they were offering for a job and what it would involve. It would involve going to New York and meeting with the national director and planning a 12 or 13 hour television marathon to raise money. And that was a completely new thing to Kentucky. So I wasn't sure, but anyway.
When was this, Daddy?
What?
1951 or 52 or what?
This was in 51, I think, yeah. Anyway, I finally decided that I wanted to take the job, and I did. And the first thing I did, I think it was the second week I was on the job, I went to New York for a week to meet the national executive director. And I got briefed on telethons and how they operate and what all is needed in terms of volunteers and so on and so on and so on. And the national executive director told me he would assign 2 technicians to me, and he would pay for their rooms and their board and so on, and they would help us orient all the volunteers, the people who are going to answer telephones, and the people who are going to collect contributions, and how it was going to be done, and so on and so on and so on. So it sounded very good to me, and I had been in New York before in the Army. I was in the training corps as a pre-medical student in New York, and I went to school at Pratt Institute in Brooklyn. So I knew New York pretty well, and knew how to get around and where the juice was and where it wasn't, And so my week in New York was very productive. And I got back to Louisville, and we immediately started setting up operations for the telethon. We set up groups of volunteers. We had several groups, telephone answerers and donation solicitors and so on and so on.
So,
and
let me ask you, was this before you actually had a TV station on board?
Before what?
Before you actually had a television station on board
Yeah.
that you were setting
Yeah.
up? So
No, actually Hansen had agreed.
Oh, okay.
WHAS had agreed.
Okay.
In fact, if he hadn't, if I'd have never gone to New York, I wrote about it in the paper, and it's in the book here, in Bob Hill's book.
Yeah.
I went to Wave TV first because the program director there had been a fraternity brother of mine at the University of Kentucky. And I thought that was the best shot I had, And he said he was interested, but he had to get the approval of his bosses. And he called me back in 2 days and said, "I'm sorry, but they don't want to do it." And so the last shot I had was WHAS. And I went there, and Ralph Hansen really liked it. He was in charge of the station. Scholas was up north, working on the campaign. And Ralph told me, he said, we'll do it, He said, we'll call Scholas and get his approval, and you heard the rest of it. You heard the phone call with Scholas.
So now you get it approved and you get everybody organized. So what are your memories of that first telethon?
Well, the memories of the first telethon are that I was just exhausted. It was I'd been up, I think by the time the telethon actually started on the air, I'd been up for about 20 hours with no sleep. And I had been going around, supporting all the volunteers and telling them what a good job they were doing and to keep at it and so on. And anyway, the telethon kicked off, and it worked out very well. The first time there was quite interesting. And then in the nighttime, I think it was about 2 o'clock in the morning, the thing just kind of stalled out. There weren't any kids around. There wasn't anybody much in Memorial Auditorium where we were staging the telethon. And I thought, oh my God, we've tanked, But I talked to some of the technicians we had from New York, and they told me, they said, no, it'll revolve back up, it'll spur up, don't worry about it. And sure enough, they were right. About 3-4 hours later, it did. It started spurring up. People started showing up. They were lined up around the Memorial Auditorium to come in, you know. And we had one of the volunteers had gone downtown and gotten a big fish tank and brought it up and set it on the stage. So we had a place where kids could walk by and throw their contributions in, you know, and go across it. And that became very, very, very popular. And we had a huge line of children all lined up, ready to walk across the stage and throw their coins in and everything. And it just, the rest of the evening and the rest of the telethon was just hugely successful. And I think we'd set a goal of raising $75,000, and we ended up raising $116,000. So it was quite successful. And I went to bed that night very, very relieved, you know. But it all worked out, and everybody was so happy, and it was amazing. It was almost like overnight you had this big teddy bear develop, you know, and everybody loved him, and that's the way it worked out.
Now, how did it transition to the Crusade for Children?
Well, that happened a couple years later. We had the first two telethons were telethons conducted by United Cerebral Palsy. And after the second one, Vic Scholas, the election was over, and Scholas was back running the show. And Scholas didn't like to be second to anybody. He wanted to be the premier guy, you know. And lo and behold, he came up with this idea of morphing the telethon into a crusade for children. And instead of just Kentucky, it would be children with cerebral palsy people in southern Indiana and the greater Louisville area, you know. And anyway,
was his concept, was he the guy who enlarged the concept from cerebral palsy people to children with all sorts of disabilities?
Yeah, he felt all children with bona fide disabilities and without the resources to help them were qualified. And they had a religious panel composed, I think, of 5 or 6 priests and preachers and so on. And for the first Crusade for Children, they were the ones who made the decisions about where the money would go. People would come to them and make presentations, and they would decide where it went and how much went and so on. And of course, I was kind of split. I had a responsibility to United Cerebral Palsy, but I also favored the Crusade for Children. I thought that made more sense. Anyway, the Crusade for Children took over, and it became more and more successful down the years, and it is hugely successful now and has literally tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of supporters across all of southern Indiana and all the Louisville area and all that.
All over Kentucky.
And there have been dozens of traditions established. You know, the firefighters with their boots collecting money, and all of that, and of course the police departments are also committed, and it's turned into a wonderful thing, I think.
So how do you feel to be one of the first people to be responsible for what has become the Crusade? How does that make you feel?
Well, it makes me feel very good. I will say this publicly for the first time, and if I get shot because of it, so be it. But Vic Scholas tried to just take over the thing and just shut out United Cerebral Palsy, period, you know? And that offended me. If it hadn't have been for United Cerebral Palsy, there would have been no telethons. And if there hadn't have been any telethons, there would have been no Crusade for Children. So the Crusade for Children is just as dependent on UCP as anything. And I resent the fact of Scholas trying to just snuff it out, because that's what he's done. But I don't think he's been entirely successful. So we'll see.
Okay.
Yeah.
This is a mother preparing her child to appear.
Sure.
You know, we had all these people with entertainers and everything. They were all ready to perform.
Yeah. There's some really
Another cerebral
adorable
palsy
kids.
child.
Yeah. Cute.
Here's some
Look like
police
sheriffs,
officers.
yeah,
Yeah.
maybe sheriffs or something, deputy sheriffs. Here are the money that they've collected.
Yeah.
In these different bins. Look at all those
Yeah.
pennies and.
Yeah, here's some kids.
Mhm.
Yeah,
Go
getting
back
ready.
to the first
to-
picture of Scholas, if you would, please, and just talk about him just a little bit.
So, Daddy, now this is Hanson, right?
This is Ralph Hansen,
yeah.
and this is Cab Calloway,
Yeah.
and this is Vic Scholas,
Right.
and this is
Jim Walton, right?
what's his name?
Jim Walton, I think is his
Yeah,
name.
Jim Walton.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, and now you can go on to other pictures, just for a couple more shots, and then I'll be finished.
What's the story of Zippy the chimp, Daddy?
Huh?
What's the story of Zippy the chimp?
Zippy the chimp?
Yeah,
I don't know.
that was after you. Okay.
Yeah.
Now, go back to that other one. Where was that? Where are those pictures taken?
Yeah, this is a bunch of.
Is that
Kids.
Memorial? Is that Memorial
Yeah,
Auditorium?
that's down in the basement. That's where they waited to walk up on stage, you know, and make their contributions and
Yeah.
so on.
Yeah.
So that's what it is.
Yeah. Okay.